Imagine two babies born on the same day in the same city. One eventually becomes a scientist designing rockets. The other spends hours online arguing about whether chocolate milk comes from brown cows. At birth, there was no way to tell them apart. But hidden inside the brain is a variable people have spent over a century trying to measure: IQ, a single number that society uses to predict their entire life trajectory. Humans have an evolutionary drive to rank things for survival. We rank the fastest car, the strongest animal, the most efficient worker. Naturally, we eventually turned that gaze towards each other, looking for a way to identify the smartest person in the room. By creating a scoring system for intelligence, we established a way to sort the population. This number decides who receives respect and who is mocked, and in some cases, who society decides to give up on entirely. Defining intelligence is surprisingly difficult. If someone can solve complex calculus but cannot navigate a basic social interaction, are they smart? What about someone who fails algebra but can walk into a room and instantly read the emotional state of everyone inside? The human mind relies on distinct capabilities: logic, language, spatial awareness, and creative problem solving. Each functions as a different part of cognition. But most IQ tests ignore these traits, focusing almost exclusively on a narrow metric: pattern-based cognitive problem-solving state. This creates a disconnect between a test score and a person's actual life. Albert Einstein possessed world-changing cognitive abilities, yet he struggled with basic daily tasks and was notoriously forgetful. High processing power does not always translate into practical success. In the early 1900s, a French psychologist named Alfred Binet developed a way to identify students who needed extra help in school. He never intended his work to become a permanent label or a measure of human value. Binet used the concept of mental age to gauge a child's progress. He explicitly warned against using these tests to rank people or suggest that intelligence was a fixed genetic trait. Modern IQ scores work differently than a test score in school. It is a relative measurement. Your score is determined by how you perform compared to the rest of the population at that specific moment. This comparison creates a bell curve, where the mathematical average is always set to 100. Most people cluster in the center. The further you move toward the edges, toward profound impairment or genius, the rarer those minds become. Evolution builds populations around a stable middle ground. When society begins to worship the rare outliers on the far right of the curve, it creates social expectations that are often isolating for those who don't fit the mold. By the 1920s, the science was being used for far more than education. Governments adopted the ideology of eugenics, using IQ tests to decide who was fit to reproduce and who should be sterilized to improve the human gene pool. Massive testing was implemented on military recruits. These exams were impersonal and often relied on specific cultural knowledge rather than innate ability, yet they were used to sort millions of men into rigid categories. Immigrants and the poor often scored lower because they lacked exposure to the language and culture of the test makers. These biased results were then used as evidence to claim these groups were biologically inferior. History shows when we reduce the complexity of a human being to a single number, it is almost always used to justify systemic abuse. The question of whether we are born with a fixed intelligence is answered by neuroplasticity. Environment, education, and even trauma physically rewire the brain. The mind is a living organ that adapts to its surroundings throughout a lifetime. While internet culture often obsesses over the high IQ genius, this focus overlooks the reality of how the world actually functions. Civilization is built and maintained by ordinary people. The infrastructure of our daily lives, from the power grid to the healthcare system, relies on consistency, resilience, and teamwork rather than raw cognitive speed. A person with an average IQ and high discipline will consistently outperform a highly intelligent person who lacks direction. Talent provides a head start, but persistence determines the finish line. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. It explains why a little bit of knowledge often leads to overconfidence, while true experts tend to doubt themselves because they understand how much they still don't know. This creates a psychological drive to lie about intelligence scores online. People use a high IQ number as a social shield, hoping to find certainty in a reality that is often unpredictable and confusing. Intelligence is just one fragment of the human experience. It cannot predict a person's kindness, their sense of morality, or their ability to find meaning in their life. But to understand the true impact of this number, we have to look at the extremes. At the highest levels of the scale, intelligence shifts from a gift into an isolating burden that changes the way a human. This map begins intelligence like video game levels, where humans suddenly hits a certain number and upgrades from a villager into a wizard. Reality is much more fluid. IQ differences dictate foundational processing capabilities, like mental speed and pattern recognition efficiency. These traits change how a person experiences basic states of being. Learning, conversation, and even boredom feel different depending on your internal processing. Think of two computers loading the same complex information. One loads the data slowly, piece by piece. The other loads it instantly. While both machines might reach the same destination, the experience of getting there is different. Intelligence defines a map of cognitive realities. Every point on that map represents a life being lived through a specific set of processing constraints. This map begins forming with surprising speed. During early childhood, cognitive architecture develops at a pace the brain will never see again. By age 5, much of the foundation for language and problem solving is already wired into place. These developmental windows are sensitive. Extreme neglect, malnutrition, or trauma can stall this growth. The brain requires specific stimulation during these periods. Without it, development often stops before reaching its potential. Because the environment helps shape these pathways, unequal childhood stability leads directly to unequal cognitive realities. At the lower end of the spectrum, below 70 IQ, we see a profound emotional capacity. These individuals experience love, fear, and frustration with the same intensity as anyone else. Many are aware they are moving at a different pace than society, noticing exclusion even when they struggle to describe it. In the 70 to 85 range, the struggle is often invisible. Because these individuals look externally average, society expects them to function at a standard pace, but internally, life requires a higher tax of effort. A lesson an average student learns in one explanation might require 5 or 10 repetitions here. The modern economy is increasingly hostile to this pace. Jobs today require software navigation, rapid communication, and digital literacy. For minds with slower processing speeds, a standard workday can feel like a high-stakes exam for which they were never given the study materials. This creates a cycle of punishment. When overwhelmed by expectations exceeding their processing speed, they are often dismissed as lazy or unmotivated. The 85 to 115 average range contains the majority of society. These minds are the adaptable, socially integrated engine of civilization. They are the people who manage relationships, learn the trades, and keep the world functional. However, our school systems often act as giant IQ detection machines. By rewarding memory and processing speed, they instantly turn intelligence into a social currency. Children notice who finishes first, and they use that speed to rank one another. But academic speed rarely predicts real-world execution. An average mind with high discipline consistently outworks a gifted mind that lacks focus. A piano prodigy who never practices is surpassed by an average musician who plays every single day. Schools sort for specific types of processing, but they only measure a fraction of human capability. They often miss emotional intelligence, practical resilience, and the grit required to succeed in unstructured environments. In the 115 to 130 gifted tier, academic success often comes without much effort. These children are frequently praised for their potential, which can create a hidden vulnerability. When a child is praised only for being smart, they often tie their entire self-worth to that specific label. This leads to a fear of failure. If being smart is your only identity, a difficult challenge becomes a threat. Some gifted adults develop arrogant defense mechanisms, treating every conversation as a competition to protect their sense of superiority. Crossing into the top 2%, IQs of 130 and above, the romantic myth of genius begins to fail. High intelligence increases awareness of systemic flaws and social contradictions. Seeing these problems clearly, without the power to fix them, often leads to deep chronic frustration and isolation. This is the curse of the overthinker. A high IQ mind functions like hundreds of browser tabs open at once. It constantly analyzes, predicts, and second-guesses, creating mental loops where a person models every potential disaster until paralyzed by complexity. High intelligence does not insulate a person from suffering. Awareness of complexity can amplify psychological vulnerabilities, making it difficult to find peace in a world that feels increasingly chaotic. The core of the problem is systemic. Nearly every school, workplace, and social standard is optimized for the average processing speed. Think of a race car forced to stay behind a slow tractor, or a bicycle trying to survive on a superhighway. In both cases, the vehicle appears dysfunctional because of the environment, not because of a mechanical failure. Using IQ as a status symbol ignores this reality. Processing speed provides no inherent path to wisdom, morality, or emotional health. When someone fails to thrive, it is rarely a sign that the mind is broken. More often, it is the result of a mismatch between an individual's processing speed and the world around them. But what happens when we look past the 130 range? Past 140 or 150, we encounter the rarest anomalies of the cognitive map. In our next installment, we explore child prodigies, the specific abilities of savants, and the threshold where extreme mental processing power creates new forms of dysfunction. Once intelligence reaches a certain height, the line separating genius from people deeply want the world to be fair. We prefer to believe that everyone starts exactly equal, and that effort alone is the only variable between success and failure. But observable reality presents a difficult truth. Just as people are born with different heights or immune systems, they are also born with varying cognitive abilities. A person solving advanced physics equations at age 12 simply processes information differently than someone struggling with basic reading. Early attempts to measure those cognitive differences were heavily flawed. Many tests relied on culturally specific questions that required knowledge unavailable to poorer communities or immigrants. They were often measuring a person's exposure to urban culture rather than their raw processing power. Modern science shows that intelligence is heavily influenced by genetics. Twin studies make that clear. However, environmental factors like childhood nutrition, stable schooling, and safety are also undeniably powerful. Intelligence is a blend of both biology and environment interacting together. Because it is neither 100% born nor 100% created, the reality of human intelligence refuses to stay politically convenient. It frustrates extremists on all sides of the debate, turning a biological discussion into a deeply explosive social issue. This chart shows average IQ scores over the course of the 20th century. You can see a massive, continuous upward trajectory across global populations. Researchers named this the Flynn effect. Humans do not evolve genetically this fast, which meant something else was happening. Modern civilization began training brains differently. A medieval farmer rarely needed to use abstract pattern reasoning on a daily basis, but today, ordinary people interact constantly with symbols, digital systems, and abstract concepts. The environment itself became mentally demanding. Recently, however, data from several countries shows the Flynn effect plateauing, and in some places, reversing. If the environmental factors that pushed our scores upward are failing, it suggests a shift in the collective cognitive capacity we've come to rely on for modern life. Deep thinking requires sustained attention, but modern technology creates environments where apps actively compete for brain chemistry. Algorithms interrupt thoughts every few minutes, training the brain to prioritize rapid novelty and fast stimulation over sustained focus. Some scientists fear this constant interruption changes cognition itself, particularly for younger generations raised entirely inside digital ecosystems, where content becomes faster, louder, and increasingly addictive. A teenager today can access lectures from world experts and learn advanced physics online for free. Yet, while we hold devices that grant access to more knowledge than any humans in history, the systems delivering that information simultaneously fracture the attention required to understand it. In highly technical fields like aerospace engineering or neurosurgery, high cognitive demands exist for a reason. But beyond a certain baseline, intelligence alone rarely guarantees success. An average entrepreneur with relentless discipline and emotional regulation will regularly outperform a genius who never finishes projects. Psychologists have also documented a phenomenon called social mismatch. If a leader thinks too abstractly compared to everyone else in the room, they often struggle connecting with their teams. A leader who cannot communicate clearly becomes ineffective, regardless of their test scores. But identifying these differences creates a new temptation: the urge to rank. Once society begins reducing human value to a single numerical score, the tool of measurement becomes a weapon of social control. This transition from measuring to engineering led directly to the dark obsession with breeding better humans through eugenics. Under the arrogant belief that humanity could select who deserved to reproduce, marginalized communities were labeled inferior, and people with disabilities were forcibly sterilized. Pseudoscience was deployed to justify systematic cruelty. Whenever society weaponizes cognitive measurement to determine human worth, compassion dies. When humans begin categorizing people too rigidly, history shows how quickly we lose our sense of common humanity. For most of history, humans assumed intelligence belonged exclusively to biological brains. Then computers arrived. Early machines were slow, but they eventually began performing tasks once considered uniquely human, processing information at speeds that biological chemistry cannot match. This strikes at a deep psychological fear. We built our identity around being the thinking species. If machines surpass human cognition in enough areas, the boundaries of what makes humans special, creativity, emotion, consciousness, become increasingly debated. As our understanding of genetics improves, humanity may eventually gain the ability to influence cognitive traits in human embryos. This creates immediate ethical nightmares, opening the door for a reality where cognitive potential becomes commercialized and wealthy parents pay to optimize their children. The human brain is an interconnected ecosystem where no trait exists in isolation. Intelligence is woven into our emotional regulation, personality, and mental health. Artificially amplifying one cognitive gear could cause others to grind, fracturing social compatibility in unpredictable ways. It is tempting to wonder what the world would look like if we had never invented IQ tests. Military selection would lose its tools, and schools would lose data for identifying learning needs. But even without formal numerical scores, humans would likely invent new ways to rank one another. Ultimately, human value cannot be captured by numbers, not by IQ, money, or grades. A genius may destroy lives, while a person with cognitive struggles may transform their community through incredible kindness. The ultimate challenge is not determining how smart you are, but what you choose to do with the mind you were given. We usually view intelligence as a linear progression. We assume a genius is a faster version of a typical human, someone who reaches the same conclusions just with less effort and a better memory. However, at the far end of the spectrum, cognitive processing shifts. The brain begins solving problems through non-linear connections and patterns that most people cannot perceive. For a 6-year-old child, this means the concepts older students struggle with, like black holes or prime numbers, become intuitive. While their peers are learning the rules of tag, these children are often mentally mapping complex systems. This creates a disconnect. Because they are processing reality at a different resolution than their peers, they often find themselves manually simulating normal social behaviors just to fit in. Childhood becomes a period of observation rather than integration. William James Sidis represents the extreme of this phenomenon. He was reportedly reading newspapers at 18 months and mastering multiple languages before primary school. When he entered Harvard at age 11, he was treated as a public exhibit. The media demanded a life of scientific breakthroughs, placing the expectations of an entire generation on a child who had barely reached adolescence. The relentless scrutiny and the demand for constant brilliance eventually broke him. Sidis ended his later years in obscurity, working menial jobs and avoiding any intellectual community that reminded him of his public miracle status. His story shows that high cognitive capacity offers no immunity to emotional distress. Instead, it can make the feeling of social isolation more acute. Savant syndrome highlights a specific neurological trade-off. It is a state where severe developmental limitations occur alongside hyper-specialized mental abilities. Daniel Tammet experienced this through numbers. He didn't calculate math through logic, he felt it. To him, every number possessed a unique color, texture, and emotional weight, allowing him to navigate math as if he were walking through a physical landscape. Many human calculators describe a similar process. They aren't performing arithmetic in the traditional sense. Their brains utilize high-speed pattern recognition to see the final answer before the steps are even calculated. These gifts suggest the brain functions as a finite system. When the mind dedicates immense resources to pattern matching and data compression, the areas responsible for social navigation and daily maintenance are often left underpowered. High-speed processing makes a standard environment feel slow and understimulating. To avoid this boredom, the brain often defaults to intense, narrow obsessions to keep its systems engaged. Nikola Tesla lived in a state of constant mental simulation. He could build, test, and repair entire machines inside his head, rotating mechanical parts and calculating friction without ever picking up a tool. This mental intensity had a clear cost. Tesla was plagued by germophobia and rigid compulsions, eventually choosing a life of total isolation, where he could manage his environment without the variables of other people. Isaac Newton followed a similar path. He revolutionized our understanding of the universe, yet he was notoriously volatile and paranoid, often becoming so consumed by his calculations that he forgot to eat or sleep. These cases suggest a psychological truth. A mind that cannot regulate its own awareness is more susceptible to anxiety and mental fatigue. At the 160 IQ level, the disconnect with the general population becomes constant. Many describe it as a form of chronic mental exhaustion, the task of perpetually simplifying their thoughts so they can be understood by others. Highly gifted children often recognize this social friction early. To avoid being targeted or isolated, they may deliberately underperform in school, masking their abilities to survive the social hierarchy of adolescence. This intelligence can also turn inward through analysis paralysis. A high-capacity mind doesn't just see a choice, it multiplies the variables, risks, and secondary outcomes until the sheer number of possibilities prevents any action at all. In contrast, a person who ignores those variables can often achieve more simply because they move forward, while the hyper-analytical mind is still calculating the risks. At this extreme, intelligence can shift from a tool for success into an obstacle. Perfectionism and overanalysis become a loop that makes even simple tasks feel impossible to start. Internet culture has turned high IQ into a brand, with people using online tests to claim a sense of superiority. But real intelligence is usually quieter and far more complicated than a score on a screen. An IQ test effectively measures specific mechanical traits: how quickly you process data, how many patterns you can hold in your working memory, and your ability to reason through logic. It ignores wisdom, empathy, and the courage to act. These are the traits that actually determine how a person uses their mind. History shows that raw processing power, when detached from a moral framework, can be used to engineer war and mass manipulation. Intelligence is a multiplier of intent, not a substitute for character. The truth about high intelligence is that it doesn't change the human condition. These minds remain vulnerable to loneliness and capable of the same failures as anyone else. We are now entering an era where the data processing and pattern recognition we once considered the peak of human achievement is being outsourced. Artificial intelligence is already performing these calculations faster and more efficiently than any human mind. If we continue to define human value strictly by the speed of our logic, we have to consider our role in a world where machines have already surpassed us. Somewhere right now, a child is secretly hiding their intelligence to avoid being bullied. They are pretending not to know the answers, faking confusion, and deliberately erasing correct work, just to fit in with the student beside them. It is strange how deeply intelligence cuts into human identity. If someone insults your clothes or your job, it is painful, but an insult to your mind hits deeper, because we treat the brain as our core self, rather than just a biological tool. Because it feels so personal, humans build entire identities around intellectual measurements. Labels like the gifted student, the genius, or the slow learner attach themselves to children for years. Eventually, people stop questioning them, and these labels ossify into invisible cages. Psychologists call this the self-fulfilling prophecy. When individuals repeatedly hear a concrete definition of what they are, they slowly begin aligning their behavior to match that exact expectation. The consequences of this prophecy run in two directions. A child branded as brilliant often becomes so terrified of losing that status that they avoid failure forever. Meanwhile, the child labeled as dumb simply stops trying, assuming effort is pointless. We rely on a rigid numerical measurement system to strictly dictate human destiny, but a single score completely fails to capture the actual depth of human potential. There is an uncomfortable truth about how we discuss intellect. Society worships the extreme top while ignoring almost everyone else. We make documentaries about the prodigy and the billionaire inventor, yet quietly forget the ordinary people who actually hold civilization together. Most of daily survival runs on invisible competence. The nurse working a night shift, the mechanic repairing vehicles nobody notices, the exhausted parents raising children. That quiet, everyday resilience, the choice to wake up and continue functioning despite deep limitations and fear, deserves profound respect. Raw intelligence can solve a mathematical equation, but resilience survives suffering, and history rewards that endurance far more consistently. This creates a strange paradox. Some highly intelligent individuals secretly envy the peace of average minds. Imagine a brain that never stops running, never stops questioning. It is a profound state of mental exhaustion, constantly predicting every future scenario and analyzing every possibility. The deeper a highly intelligent mind explores reality, the larger reality appears. The questions multiply faster than the answers, trapping the mind inside infinite uncertainty. So, while ordinary minds provide the steady endurance required to keep society functioning, extreme cognitive awareness often leaves the gifted trapped in a state of quiet emotional torture. But there is a much darker side to how we view intellect. When we equate high intelligence with inherent human superiority, we begin to believe some minds are worth more than others, and when that happens, compassion starts dying. Some of the cruelest events in history were engineered by highly intelligent people. Brilliant minds designed the systems for mass propaganda, manipulation, and mechanized warfare. This reveals a terrifying rule of human nature. A sharp mind completely devoid of empathy possesses the capacity to rationalize any destructive act. Contrast that destruction with individuals of modest intellectual ability who exhibit extraordinary patience, sacrifice, and loyalty. These are essential traits for civilization, yet impossible to measure on a standardized test. Human survival relies absolutely on cooperation. A world populated exclusively by highly intelligent, uncompassionate individuals would quickly self-destruct. Cooperation requires empathy. If the survival of our species depends on empathy and connection, it stands to reason these same qualities define our personal lives as well. When the noise of societal ranking fades, the tests, the titles, the comparisons, we are left with a fundamental question: what makes a life feel finished? A meaningful life defies numerical measurement. A genius with a 160 IQ can easily become isolated, anxious, and miserable, while an individual with an 85 IQ can build deeply meaningful relationships and experience intense emotional fulfillment every single day. And the value we place on a cognitive score is currently being challenged. Artificial intelligence is merging with human cognition, changing how we define a smart person and how we process information. For thousands of years, memorization and logic-heavy tasks were the primary markers of intelligence. But as AI handles complex analytical problems instantly, the human ability to calculate or memorize becomes a secondary skill. If machines can compute better than us, human value shifts toward the qualities algorithms cannot replicate: our emotional depth, our creative intuition, and ethical judgment. The future hierarchy of value will not reward those who calculate the fastest. Success will belong to those who understand humanity the best. The fact that billions of humans continue cooperating despite our massive egos, our fears, and our differences is extraordinary. That quiet collaboration is civilization's greatest actual achievement. Intelligence matters, but a number cannot map the full architecture of your life. Your humor, your courage, and your memories exist beyond the reach of a standardized test. In the end, empathy itself is humanity's greatest genius.